I'm very happy to be with you this morning. I hope it's a good opportunity to discuss Detroit in particular. One update I would say is I'm very pleased to hear about the mayor's staff and the city council staff coming together to work on a response to the draft consent agreement that we presented to the review team and also shared with the city council members and the general public. I believe that's a constructive step, and hopefully we'll get some feedback relatively soon. We are on a tight timeline. March 26th is the due date for the review team to put out their report, and to make that clear, their basic choices are to say, one, there is a consent agreement, two, that there is no financial emergency, or three, they recommend an emergency manager. Technically, there's a fourth answer, but it's not really applicable here. So those are the three choices that they have in front of them on March 26th. So hopefully that sets the stage, because I really want to have a dialogue and see what questions you have.
The first one.
Just for the live stream.
All right. Yeah, Rod Maloney, Channel 4 Detroit. The first question I have is you're saying that the counteroffer is constructive, but it's clear that within the city, the understanding is that they want to have the city council and the mayor retain power. And your offer was for them to report to someone, and clearly that's the rub here. So if they counter with anything that resembles them retaining their current power, is that something that you can live with?
Well, again, I would go back to say they absolutely have power under the draft consent agreement, a lot of power. Are there constraints on certain areas of their power? Yes. But it doesn't take away all their power by any means. If you look at the actual draft agreement, in the draft agreement itself, it talks about the role of the mayor still continuing to be chief executive of the executive branch of government. It talks about the city council being the legislative body. If you think about the roles of the city and its responsibilities, they have clear authority for the vision for the city, the strategy for the city, the policies of the city. It's when you get to financial matters in implementation, is there more involvement from what the consent agreement would create. So it talks about the Financial Advisory Board being involved in financial decision-making and stability questions there. And then when it comes to the implementation of the restructuring and the need to do that, it really creates kind of a joint arrangement where they're participating with the mayor in terms of some of the operating people to make sure the work is getting done that's required to show action to follow along with the plans of the mayor, the city council, and this review board.
Is there any way that you would accept a counteroffer from them that did away with or did not have an advisory board attached? In other words, how married are you to the notion of the 9-member advisory board?
Well, again, I think that's one of the fundamental things to help with financial stability and financial matters. What I would say, to the degree it's 9 people or how they get appointed, again, I'm open-minded to hearing feedback on how they think it works. The concept of an advisory board is a good one if you think about it. One thing I would ask, too, if you step back and look at the perspective on this, is instead of viewing the advisory board as an adversarial body, which it's not intended to be, think about this. If you were running an organization, if you're running a city or any kind of organization, and you had an opportunity to say, now to help you, because there's a history of how many decades of financial challenge, now there's a group in this particular draft of 9 financial experts that would have a wide variety of background that you could draw on their expertise to help the mayor and city council to develop their budget. Most people would be very excited to say, I'm really glad I don't have to go pay for huge consulting fees to have a group of that kind of expertise available to help us make better decision making. So in some ways, I think it's important to step back and say, and very much, as people approach this, you could turn this to a positive opportunity to say, now here's a whole nother litany of expertise, thought processes to say we can do better work and have better consistency over time, because they've been struggling to have the resources they fully should have in terms of financial expertise in the city today.
Alexis Wiley, Fox 2 in Detroit. Governor, some might say that because of the way this financial advisory board is crafted, the fact that they essentially hold the purse strings, that they will have a lot of power. And some, including Mayor Bing, have called this, essentially this financial advisory board is going to be just a board of emergency managers. What's your response to that?
Well, I think that came up partially in the last question, that, again, the mayor and the city council are responsible for strategy, policy. Again, if it's talking about the building code, the zoning code, other operations of the city, the financial advisory board isn't involved in that. They're involved in fiscal matters.
But isn't
And
every
that's-
matter fiscal
what's that?
in some ways? But aren't most matters going to require, the funding?
Again, what you do is the normal process that we would just do in the state. And some of these constructs are actually things I looked at in terms of the state mile when we walked through it, in terms of they're going to help do a revenue estimating conference. The new charter actually asked for that. That was something missing in the past from Detroit. To do a revenue estimating conference, they would be involved in that process to say, how good are those estimates of future revenue? And wouldn't it be helpful to have 9 people that are financial experts also involved in that process? And then when it came to a budget, the mayor and city council would follow their budget process, but it would also get review and feedback from this group. Isn't that a good thing to get feedback? And then to the degree that the forecast isn't being followed because of results not being quite as good, and there's a need to correct things, this group could be involved in that process to say, now we need to make adjustments and be thoughtful on that. That's really kind of the 2 or 3 key steps they play in this, that if you look at it in many respects, it could be a very helpful role and doesn't need to be viewed as a negative role. Because if you look today, again, 9 financial experts with a broad background to help make decisions compared to an environment today where the city's struggling to have enough financial expertise to do a budget or to do their forecasting, this would be a big improvement. And the other part to remind people is this is not a commentary on the current leadership of the city at all. This is intended to say, if you looked at how many decades of history, wouldn't this have been helpful during any one of those time periods to hopefully make better decisions? And so let's have them be there for some time period going forward, regardless of who's mayor and city council, until the city's truly stable, because that would give more confidence to the citizens of the city, people working for the city, vendors to the city, debt holders of the city, and people looking to invest in Detroit to know they've got this group of financial experts helping the mayor and city council in a constructive way.
Good morning, Governor Val Clark, WXYZ TV, Detroit. Governor, I know we have a lot of territory to cover, so forgive me for following up with my colleagues on the advisory board. I think here's the rub as far as what the mayor has indicated to us. You have 9 members, although they have part of the selection process, even 3 that they share selection process come from 6 that you and the treasurer would put forth. So the deck does seem to be stacked against them, and it is adversarial, they believe, not helpful, because this advisory board has the final authority to set aside anything that they may come up with.
Again, that's not accurate if you talk about anything they come up with. If it's a financial matter or it's involving implementation, they would be involved with it. But again, the broad strategy and policy of the city, it's clear outside of those financial issues, they would not be involved with. And then you look at the board composition itself. Again, these are things that we put out a draft. There are 9 members on this board. Actually, the treasurer would be one. The treasurer gets an appointee. I get 1 appointee. There are 6 other members. Now, of those 6, 3 come from people I would recommend. But as a practical matter, you could call those joint appointments almost in some fashion. So I don't view it as us simply dominating the board. It's really us working together to build a board, because there are only 3 that are purely coming from the state. The other 6, 3 of which are coming purely from the city, and then you've got 3 that are coming from kind of a group basis in some fashion.
As a quick follow-up, Governor, what about the plan, though? The mayor says that he has put forth several plans that he didn't get feedback from you all, and not to make this a tit-for-tat on every one of these points. But have you seen something? He said, look, we're saving millions of dollars from the unions. We've got at least a partial commitment. What have you seen, if anything, from what they have passed along to you that you can live with, and that's possibly actually part of this consent agreement?
Yeah, we've been in continuing discussions, and we've given feedback on a continuing basis on everything the city's put forward. So we've been very diligent about doing good feedback. As a practical matter, if you look at it, if you follow through that process, there have been some good things done or things in the right direction done. The question is did they go far enough to get to the point of financial stability? And that is a challenging point. I don't believe they've reached that point. And one thing I would ask you to look at is if you look at the city council's review of those issues, I don't believe they believe the mayor's gone far enough or gotten to where he needs to get. So I'm not saying that's just our opinion. I think you can look at the city itself, particularly the city council, for feedback on that issue.
Karen Fire Detroit News. On Tuesday, after some of the backlash in the morning, Andy Dillon came out, Treasurer Dillon came out with a statement that the city would be able to access some revenue of some sort through refinancing and also through some bond issue possibilities. Are those not possibilities that the city would have even without appointing this advisory board? And I'm wondering if there was any thought to giving any actual short-term cash assistance to the city, and if you think that had some kind of cash assistance been part of this proposed consent agreement, if it would have perhaps gotten a better reception from the city officials.
Yeah, I would say I would not have any expectation of short-term cash assistance from the state directly as a practical matter, because we need long-term solutions. We need structural solutions in place, and we need to see that there's a path to do that. If you look at, we're financially challenged ourselves, the state. If you look at it, the city does have some ability to do some refinancing, and we're being supportive in that process in terms of what Treasury is doing. So they're working diligently on a parallel path with the city to look at what refinancings are possible of city debt.
Is there any part of that package of opportunities that Treasurer Dillon said would be possible for the city? Is there any part of that that the city couldn't just go ahead and do without consenting to this agreement?
Well, again, this is where the Treasury is actually being a supporting role. The city's always got some flexibility to do their own thing, but I think given the constraints and the history where they're at, the Treasury is being supportive, and so they'll be talking to City Council about that. But I would leave that to the Treasury Department to talk about all those terms, and that'll be something that they'll be talking to City Council about.
So other than the advisory board and the advice from experts that the city, possibly could actually take on their own accord, what incentives are there for the city to go ahead and agree to this consent agreement, which involves turning over the control of the elected officials, in their opinion?
Yeah, well, if you stop and say, what are the other options? The other options are not particularly positive, because again, the city is responsible for running their city, and the choices are not good. The consent agreement is much better. The other part is I want to be proactive on coming up with thoughtful ideas, and we've been very diligent about doing that already. So to say there are incentives, there are things we always want to help the city with in terms of being successful, whether it's in a financial emergency or not. And if you just look at my message on public safety, it was how can we help with the criminal justice system in Detroit in terms of more law enforcement, better courts for mental health courts, drug courts, a structural jobs program for the structurally unemployed, for at-risk youth. I mean, we're proposing a lot of good things to help the city. So I feel good about that. If you look at the legislators are being supportive by working on the Regional Transit Authority. Because again, that would in large case benefit many Detroit residents in terms of a rolling rapid bus system that could take place and an authority to manage transit for southeastern Michigan. So we're not being passive on the positive side. Actually, I think I want to encourage people to be more positive. The thing is we've got to get this negative issue behind us in terms of let's get to financial stability so we can build on a base. I want to see Detroit be a great city. Let's go. On the positive side, let's get this tough stuff behind us and move forward in a constructive, positive way.
Morning, Governor. Paul Egan, Detroit Free Press. You've made a lot of comparisons to the New York City situation, and a significant difference that many people have pointed out is that that was accompanied with large sums of federal and state money. If the city was to embrace a plan that actually addressed these structural problems that set them on a stable footing for the longer term, why couldn't the plan include money to address some of these legacy costs and long-term debt that no amount of negotiations with unions is ever going to be able to erase?
Well, that's one of the questions that, it's a fair question to ask, but as a practical matter, we're the state of Michigan, and we have a responsibility to all the citizens in Michigan, and Detroit's not alone in terms of having high structural costs for legacy costs, for health care or pension. So it's not just singling out one jurisdiction. that would be an issue that would be addressed by the legislature and the governor over time to look at all jurisdictions, and right now, we're not in a position to do that. To the degree the New York solution involved going to the federal government, again, the city of Detroit's always welcome to talk to the federal government about what help they can get from them, and we want to partner well with the city, the county, the federal government, and the state on all working together to make the city successful.
Do you think some federal help would be in order?
I'm not going to speak for the federal government. We have enough issues at the state of Michigan that I stay focused on those.
Governor, we have a couple of questions from Matt at the Wall Street Journal being streamed in. First one is, if Detroit runs out of money and misses its debt payments, what liability does the state have for Detroit's debt?
Again, there's different categories there. Much of Detroit's debt is Detroit's debt. And so it's only a legal liability to the city of Detroit, not the state of Michigan. So we would have to review all that, but as a practical matter, much of it in terms of liabilities belong to the city.
Number two, would you agree to give the city more money, not just loans, after a consent agreement was in place?
Not necessarily. I would not assume that, because again, we have a challenge budget still at the state. We just went through $1.5 billion deficit last year, and we have a number of other communities that are going through challenges, not to the same degree in terms of number of people in the city as Detroit, but we have a lot of challenges between school districts and cities, and we want to make sure we're doing a good job of supporting jurisdictions all across Michigan.
Governor, can you speak a little bit as to why this draft looks so much different than the Inkster agreement?
Oh, in terms of the Inkster agreement? Well, that's just part of the drafting process as a practical matter. Again, the Treasury Department worked on that with the city of Inkster, and they came to an agreement, and it just got done. This was a case where we had ongoing dialogue with the city for some time about how we can work together, and this draft came together in that fashion to try to respond to some of the best ways to be successful in Detroit.
And in the Inkster case, a lot of the feedback from City Council got incorporated into the final agreement. How much wiggle room is there in this draft?
It depends what wiggle people are asking for. And that's why we want to be very open to say we're waiting for feedback. And that's what we would have preferred earlier in the process. It would have been much nicer to get feedback earlier than being a week or so away from the deadline.
Kathy Barks-Hoffman from the Associated Press. Governor, is there anything that Detroit can do? I mean, they do have assets. Is it too late for them to suddenly say, we'll sell something off and solve our own issues and not have to deal with this? I mean, basically, the Financial Review Board makes a decision within a week, a recommendation within a week and a half. And I mean, is there some wiggle way the city could say, we're just going to take drastic action and do this now?
They could. Again, that would be their decision. Again, the issue of the Financial Review Board technically is the review board can come out and say there's no financial emergency. As a practical matter, I'm not sure what actions they would be able to take in that time frame to say there are actions that could get them out of the financial challenges they have. Theoretically, that's possible. Practically, I tend to doubt it. But again, that's not us making the decision. That's more the city making those calls.
Governor John Lindstrom of Gongwer. There's a provision in the consent draft agreement that if the financial review team, if any part of the consent agreement is challenged in court, an emergency manager would automatically be named. And some people have said that that amounts essentially to extortion. Why was that provision put into the agreement?
It's a draft agreement. Come back with comments.
I'm here. Oh, okay. Alexis Wiley again, Fox 2. One concern, I mean, people in Detroit, a lot of people in Detroit, leaders in Detroit have exploded with a lot of anger after this draft was presented. What do you say to them to get them back on board? Is there anything that can be done to kind of quench some of the anger that's going on right now?
Well, again, I'm not sure everyone has anger. There is clearly a subset that has a fair amount of anger. Right. And the real question is this problem is not the people involved with it just today. The issues that we're talking about for Detroit have been building for decades. And I think that's important to remember. And the real question is that couldn't continue for more decades. It just is not financially or physically possible to see that path continue, and it's not a good path. The real path we need to get on is getting the city to be successful, to see a growing Detroit, better services, in terms of public safety, lighting, transit for the citizens. And that's fundamentally based on financial stability as one of the starting points for that. So what I hope would happen is much like any time when you're talking about saying, was the path they are on working well? And was there a need for some significant change? Significant change is difficult for people. People handle that in different ways. And what I would hope after an initial reaction, that people step back and say, is this the best path to get us to be successful? Not to continue the decline that the city's been on for far too long. But let's get us on a path to success where we can show we can win together and we can play a supportive role with the city running their city. I mean, if you look at it, we had that issue last year here at the state level in a number of cases, where when we talked about change, it was very difficult. But as a practical matter, we've made good progress. And as we had an opportunity to really talk about what the issues are and how we're in this together, how this is not about fighting or about having someone lose, but about how we can all say, this is a better answer for all of us, and doesn't everyone want to move forward and see Detroit become a great place again? So I just hope people have time to reflect. That was part of the goal of getting the draft to the review team and to the members of the city council on Tuesday. So there would be a time for initial reaction, feedback, thoughts, and the thing now is the city council and the mayor's staff are starting to sit down to talk about how to respond in terms of specific items in the agreement that they don't like, as opposed to, just generalized statements that they don't like it, or other comments.
Governor, this is a question from Nancy at Crane's Detroit Business. Would a consent agreement impact the bond ratings of the state or other communities?
It's always one of these tough questions because with respect to any jurisdiction, they are relatively separate. So technically, it shouldn't impact anything around the area, but it can have some influence. The actual track record is somewhat mixed. Vallejo, California went bankrupt. In that particular case, it didn't have a large impact on any of the surrounding areas. But you don't know for sure. So that's kind of an unknown as part of this equation. One thing is that we did get feedback is that was more from one of the bond rating agencies that made a commentary on Public Act 4 to say if it was suspended or went away, they would view it as a negative outlook in terms of how they would look at jurisdictions in our state.
Governor Chris Christoph, Bloomberg News. Just to be clear, is the drop dead date on this to get a consent agreement agreed to on all parties March 27th? And if it doesn't happen by then, the review team will appoint an emergency manager.
I'm glad you asked, Chris, to clarify that. It's actually March 26th is the date for the review team to finish their work. I think we had some confusion because we had with leap year in there in terms of the calendar, but it's March 26th, so it's that Monday. And what their role is on that date is to make a recommendation. It's not a decision, it's a recommendation to me. So the recommendation comes to me of one of those three choices, basically: no financial distress, consent agreement, or emergency manager. And then I have a limited amount of time to make a decision.
But do you have to make that decision within 10 days? Is that what the time limit is?
I believe that's the number in the statute, Tim.
Okay, and at the end of the 10 days, look, you said, I don't want to appoint an emergency manager right now. Would you have more time to review this and perhaps hope for another settlement?
I don't believe the statute answers that question.
Well, and then in other words, you could.
The statute doesn't answer that question, and that would be a legal opinion.
Well, you're a lawyer.
I'm more of an accountant.
There is something, it's not a drop-dead date, 10 days after March 27th.
Again, that would be a legal question, Tim, that I'm not going to answer here, but it's a legal question that could be answered to say, what does that mean?
Well, are you asking your legal advisor for an opinion?
I have our legal people working on lots of issues.
Governor, the time issue certainly still concerns me, but I want to take a step back. When you discuss the notion that the city of Detroit is responsible for its bond debt, my recollection is that there's about $400 million worth of bonds that if they default on, that money comes due. So it begs the question, who pays the bondholders in that situation?
Yeah, there's an issue if they go to emergency manager, and we're still reviewing all this, but it appears that they have a number of swaps out there that could be triggered if they go to emergency manager. And that would be a case then, that would be a complexity that they would have to be paid or refinanced in some fashion.
Governor, Peter Ross from WZZM Grand Rapids. What are the implications, if any, for outstate cities and communities for a successful resolution of this? Grand Rapids, Marquette, and so on.
Yeah, well, that's why it's an important thing for all our state. It's, in my view, the long-term answer for Michigan to be a great state is we need Detroit on the path to being a great city again. And for Detroit to be a great city again, we need financial stability in the city of Detroit. And we need to focus in on better services to the citizens in Detroit, with the state providing a supporting role in that process. So it does have impact on all Michiganders across the state. Also, what I would say, though, in terms of sometimes people like to throw out broad solutions or dollar solutions, my role is to represent the citizens of the state of Michigan, and we have to be thoughtful about being good fiduciaries of the resources of the state to make sure we're doing a good job for all the state of Michigan. And so there's a balancing act there in terms of what's possible for Detroit or making sure we're doing the right balance for all citizens of our state. But it is important that we get Detroit on a positive path. It's the bottom line of all this.
Governor, I know that you and the mayor have so far enjoyed a good relationship. Yesterday he said it wasn't personal, but he seemed personally upset with you. Are you concerned that if you don't have good relations with him, and he with you, that this is going to further complicate getting a solution? And do you want to respond to anything that you've heard that he said about you yesterday?
Yeah, what I would say on that is I'm not going to respond to any of that, because my view is it's unfortunate that it became personal in terms of his comments. And I'm governor of the state of Michigan, and I try to treat that in a professional fashion, and personalities are not the relevant decision-making factor or should not influence how behavior happens. So I'm going to work hard to be a good governor and hold the olive branch out and say, how do we work together to solve this collectively and collaboratively? And I look forward to having a positive working relationship with everyone in the state of Michigan.
Governor Kyle Malin from the MERS newsletter, and also a question for Harvey, really, because you did appoint an emergency manager for the city of Flint. We didn't get a sliver of this kind of backlash or reaction or whatnot. What makes Detroit different from Flint or any other city that you've had to do some type of emergency manager decision?
Good question, Kyle. I'm not sure I know the answer, because in Flint it's been an interesting case. I did the public safety message up there a week or so ago, and the mayor introduced me, and we had city council people in the session, and they have an emergency manager, and they're all working together to solve problems. The other illustration I'll give you is Roy Roberts in the Detroit Public Schools. I think a lot of people respect what Roy's doing, and we're showing progress in Detroit with kids getting an education and good things going on there. So I'm not going to speculate on that. Again, there are people that are lifelong Detroiters or part of that process that can probably give you better insight than I can. I just ask that people really try to look at the long term and to say, this should not be an adversarial situation.
So there could be some politicking going on here.
There isn't from Lansing.
No, but from Detroit. Do you feel like there's politicking going on down there?
Again, that's not my role to make those decisions. I'm here to hopefully represent the state of Michigan well in a very professional fashion, to say I'm here to come up with solutions with a group of people that we're all in this together. Someone asked me that earlier, that sometimes people like to just say there's Detroit and then there's Michigan, and the way I like to describe it, it's Detroit, Michigan. We're all in this together.
Can I go? Yeah, Rod Maloney again, Channel 4 News, Detroit. Governor, one of the consistent themes that has come up in the city recently from both the mayor and council is that this action, even the consent decree offer or contract offer that you've made, is unconstitutional. Which leads me to the question of a court date that's set for a week from today here in Ingham County before Judge Collette. Where do you come down and how do you explain how, one, this is constitutional, and two, is Judge Collette correct in his assessment that this operation has to be conducted in public, and therefore anything that happened prior to is unconstitutional as well?
Yeah, well, there's actually two or three pieces of what you ask. You brought up Judge Collette, and his focus has been on the open meetings piece. not with respect to Public Act 4, but was their compliance with the Open Meetings Act. And this advisory board has been, or this review team has been going through compliance with the Open Meetings Act. So there should be no issue there. Again, that's up for people to bring questions before Judge Collette, and I believe there's more part of this process going on, so I'm not going to say I can't give his opinion. He's a judge, so I respect what he's doing. But that's an open meetings question. There's a second broader question about Public Act 4, and I think it's not necessarily the whole act, but certain portions regarding labor agreements, extinguishing those, which really isn't on the table in a consent agreement in terms of abrogating existing agreements. A consent agreement, that power does not exist in that format. So, again, that raises another set of questions that may get to Public Act 4 itself. But on the face of it, no. And again, there's no decision to say it's illegal. So we should be assuming it's legal. So you should move ahead under that context. And then you come to the simple fact, this is a consent agreement that hopefully we get to. So in many respects, it's as simple as saying, isn't this a contract? A contract that would be between the city and the state of Michigan, and how we could operate together to provide success in the city. How we could play a supporting role with respect to financial stability and implementation, and then hopefully help on a lot of other things. So as a practical matter, if you look at it, this is a way to help. So that's, again, that dialogue when people first see something. Do you take it from a negative perspective or a positive perspective of, is it helpful? It's made to be helpful and to provide success, not to be punitive at all.
But the belief is that the consent agreement or even an emergency manager removes the publicly elected officials from the decision-making duties that they were supposed to be involved with in the first place. They believe that this is, in effect, a power grab. They believe the power grab is unconstitutional. I'm just echoing the sentiment there. I want to get your thoughts on this notion that this is all unconstitutional.
If people consent to an agreement, it's not a constitutional question. They consented to agree on how they're going to work together. I mean, that's basic common law and contract law. It's the way, again, that would be the simple interpretation of it. If you have two people agreeing to do something or two parties agreeing to do something, why would that be unconstitutional?
They don't agree with it. They don't agree with it with an
So,
emergency manager.
no, I'm just saying.
Governor, a little bit more on the deadlines. Does City Council or the Mayor have a fixed amount of time to present a counter proposal to you?
The answer to that, in terms of a fixed amount of time, no, other than the May 26th date. Again, the sooner they respond, the easier it is for us to have, March 26th, I'm sorry, March 26th, the easier it is for us to have dialogue, and the better dialogue we would have. So I just encourage them to work promptly and to get us something quickly, so we can have that discussion. The sooner the better.
Governor Kathy Hoffman again from the Associated Press. This is raising Michigan's profile as far as this emergency manager law. We're a little bit unique in the power that it gives people. Are you getting calls from other governors, or is your staff getting calls from people that are interested in this? I mean, are they, I'm sure, we've had earlier laws and other states have had similar things, but are people paying attention to this, and are they thinking of copying Michigan for this reason?
I haven't had a lot of contact or discussion on it, because this is a national issue in terms of jurisdictions being challenged or having tough times. I mean, one of the more public ones would be Harrisburg in Pennsylvania. But as a practical matter, I think people are watching, but we haven't had a lot of dialogue and discussion with other jurisdictions.
Governor, I think Detroit City Council would argue that they have been pushing for bolder reforms and doing everything in their power to right the fiscal ship. Should they be given more power in any consent decree?
Well, again, the consent decree that we put forward actually has them continue as the legislative body. What I would hope happens is, and I appreciate their perspective, is there's an opportunity for them to work with the mayor and this financial review board to, again, continue to bring up good ideas. And by having this group of financial experts, there may be another resource there for them to get good feedback and reinforcement and documentation or analysis to say some of their ideas are good ones, and could they be adopted by having good better communication with the mayor. So this group could be a facilitator to help take those ideas and translate them into action as appropriate.
Karen Fire, Detroit News. You indicated earlier that that any kind of short-term cash assistance would be unlikely to follow the signing of the consent agreement. Is it an impossibility? Are you saying that there will be no short-term cash assistance as part of the consent agreement deal or following the consent agreement?
Well, again, I'm not going to generate speculation, but I would say that there should be no expectation from the city of short-term financial assistance from the state until there's a real, at least until there's some solution for the long term. And then again, it would be a question on the resources of the state to say what's available to help and what's appropriate, given we have other jurisdictions and challenging environments.
Okay, so you're saying that you are open then to some kind of short-term cash assistance?
I would say I would not expect that.
Hey, Governor, Liam with Channel 10 News in Lansing. Do you see the advisory board idea as a potential alternative to emergency managers in other cities going forward across the state?
In terms of the idea of an advisory board, I think it's a good concept to use potentially on the consent agreement situation in particular, to say, here's an area where many communities don't have all the financial expertise you would like to deal with these difficult issues. And so I view it as it could be a good supportive resource to talk about with different jurisdictions to say, wouldn't you like to be able to call on a group of people that are financial experts in different fields that could be helpful in terms of analyzing situations, helping you with estimating your revenue and doing your budget?
Governor Leonard Fleming, Detroit News. Would you be open to the mayor and city council appointing more, having more appointees to the advisory board, more so than what the current agreement has at this point?
Well, again, I've made it clear I'm open to feedback on, I don't see the board getting bigger than 9 necessarily. That's a fairly good-sized board. How we go through the process, I'm open-minded in looking at that, with the thing to make sure that there is enough oversight and involvement from the state.
So you've touched a lot on the short-term cash, but as you know, there's an effort by Detroit legislators to get to that state surplus money that Detroit officials say they're entitled to. What's your thought on that? Is there a chance that the city of Detroit could get that surplus money, even in a some sort of system where they got $50 million for 4 years? What's your thought on that surplus money?
Well, again, that goes back to the $200 million question, and as a practical matter, that's something that goes back to the prior administration that supposedly Governor Granholm did one arrangement and then undid some arrangement, and I'm not going to speculate on that. As a practical matter, the state is always going to try to be helpful to our jurisdictions in a constructive way, within the constraints of our budget, and understanding that we've got a big state and we have multiple places we need to be thoughtful about, and what's the best use of those dollars for all our citizens. So again, that's where I put a focus on public safety, for example, this year, to say I believe that was a good use of resources in asking the legislature to hopefully appropriate those dollars, because that's an issue that we can focus in on for communities, but also help the state on really a critical issue.
We have time for 2 more.
Governor, you've been clear that you think Detroit is critical to Michigan's success. Do you think that view is widespread in Michigan, and do you think you and others have a selling job to do in terms of convincing people that, you know, that this is important to them? I think there's an attitude among many people, rightly or wrongly, as, you know, it's their problem, let them sort it out or let them go bankrupt.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things. We have a very diverse state in terms of, you know, a big state and a lot of different geographies and how people have their own sort of regions within our state. So it's something I've been very clear as I campaigned across Michigan. I would make the comment that we need Detroit on the path to being a great city in almost every town hall I did. And largely I got support from people. Were there people that disagreed with it? Yeah, but at least I made it clear how I felt about it, and that was part of how I campaigned. So I think it's important we have a good dialogue, and I think it's important to have the rest of Michigan participate in that, because we are one state.
Governor, there's a section in the consent agreement that states that elected officials, union members cannot seek to undermine Public Act 4. Is that something that you would be willing to negotiate on to take out of the agreement if the mayor and others on council who have been against Public Act 4 from the very beginning, if they were to fight to get that out of there, would you be willing to take that language out of the consent agreement?
Yeah, well, I want to be a little bit careful because you shouldn't take one-off issues and one at a time versus saying if they have a whole set of issues, put all the issues on the table and let's look through the whole list. With respect to that, I'm happy, again, to get feedback on what works or may not work within that particular provision. I think it's important to say, though, that at some point, if it's a consent agreement, it needs to be an agreement where if after 3 months, 6 months, or a year, suddenly they don't want to honor the agreement, that there needs to be some consequence to that. That it's not simply, you know, they can be in this agreement as long as they want to be and then just sort of change their mind. That would be a problem to suggest something like that.
But if that's a major sticking point, though, is that something that you'd be willing to deal with, to negotiate?
I think I've always been a pretty reasonable person on a lot of things. It's more, let's just sit down and talk. And again, that was the big issue here, is we had worked closely with the mayor, and there were a number of days out there where we could have done a lot. As a practical matter, all we were told was no. So now it's a point of saying that's why we put the public draft out to the review team, so we can have all this dialogue and get feedback on the particulars, and it's good to see the mayor's staff and the city council staff working together to achieve that.
Hi, Governor.
Hi.
The Detroit Democrats had a press conference on Tuesday, and Representative Womack said that it seems that so far, all the cities that have had financial managers or consent agreements have had large minority populations. And he said perhaps there are some cities with larger white populations that have not had these kind of actions. And he made the implication that perhaps there was a lack of confidence in cities run by large minority populations. Can you react to that?
Yeah, that's not the case. As a practical matter, if you look at it, it's really about financial affairs and where that stands, and the common denominator of where you find these issues is population decline. It's really a case of watching populations drop fairly dramatically and the communities not being able to, or having a challenge of adjusting their cost structures to appropriately address that. So again, there's no racial element in it. In Michigan, we've had challenges on race, so I don't want to minimize the fact that race is an issue out there that we always need to be sensitive to, and we should be. But with respect to the emergency manager law, it's a function largely of population decline, people moving out. And if you look at, that's one of the challenges of Detroit today, that I think people were surprised by the big drop in population in Detroit in the last census. And the key to success here is not just financial stability. It's about giving better services to citizens on bus, transit, all these lighting, all those areas, and growing the city of Detroit. If someone asks the question, how do you know when you're succeeding really? Well, we can have financial measures to do that. Well, one of the best measures to say that things are working well is Detroit is now growing. And how do you get Detroit on the path to being a city of 800,000 people, 900,000 people, back to 1 million people? Isn't that the exciting answer that we all want?
Thank you, Governor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.